Booktalk with the Daughters of St. Paul. I'm Jeannette de Beauvoir.
And I'm Sister Kathryn Hermes.
And this week and the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about Kalina's Midwife for Souls. This is a book about spiritual care for the dying. And I just want to briefly say what she talks about in terms of defining hospice care. She says hospice care is loving support for patients who are living their last days and for their families. This support is physical, psychological, and spiritual. The hospice team consists of nurses, doctors, social workers, home health aides, clergy, and volunteers, and their roles often overlap. But I think that one of the first things we need to say is that the title is brilliant because we always think of a midwife as bringing a baby into the world.
Yes.
And in essence, she's talking about bringing a soul from the world into heaven. And in fact, the poem that she writes at the beginning, I love. She says, "Let us love with the urgency of the dying and the innocence of the newborn." And that really does bring it together, doesn't it?
Yes. And there is that sense of urgency when someone you love is dying, the urgency to say what you want to say, to be there for that person in really the way they need to be there. And I think that's the treasure of this book. It really gives you everything you need to have that confidence to walk into a new situation for yourself and for that person.
And I think that this is a really great guide. It does say specifically that it's a pastoral guide for hospice care workers, but honestly, I think this book is for everyone. I think that one of the things she does beautifully is use a vocabulary that we might not be used to. She talks about angels, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute, but she talks about soul to soul time, which I find just an amazing concept. And I get it. I've never thought the words, but I get the concept. She talks about praying over the wall, praying them over the wall. So that there's this gentleness in this book that I think a lot of people don't associate with dying. Dying feels just so violent, even if it's not a violent death, because it's such a radical change from one life to the other. And there's a gentleness here that I find.
And it seems like an end. Dying seems like an end, even though we have faith in eternity, but praying them over the wall, it's like going from the wall into a garden. It's beautiful.
Precisely,
Yes.
precisely. I think that she's chosen her vocabulary very carefully. But I do want to start with angels. I really do, because, and it's true, many of us who have heard of people dying or been with people dying will know that they look up. And she talks about there's a certain place where the ceiling and the wall intersect. It seems to be the place that people look. And I have to read just this one little passage. It's really beautiful. So as I said, she says, when patients travel far enough to get a glimpse of the other side, they begin to stare at the point where the wall and ceiling meet. More than once, I've heard patients announce joyfully, "There are angels all over this room." One lady said, "Why didn't you tell me it would be so beautiful?" I said, "Because I haven't been down that road." She laughed and said, "Oh, that's right," and turned her attention back to the angel show. I love the way she talks about angels, because of course that's the way we often see angels, as messengers of God, but also as guardians.
Yes. Recently, actually, several of our sisters have passed into eternity. And I remember one sister in particular, I was with her quite a lot. And one day, as I was actually saying to her, the Blessed Mother songs in Italian that she liked. And I would be singing to her and she'd be looking at me, but then her eyes would kind of stray and she'd be looking very intently over my shoulder. And it was just such an awesome feeling that there was someone else in this room.
Right, you weren't there
And
alone.
I just became very quiet because I knew there was someone else there. And she has so many stories. That's why I love this book, because of the stories. But there's a story about a young man named Bryce who had seizures and who was coming up to the very moment of his death. But he wasn't quite letting go, and his grandmother was there. And he asked the grandmother, and he said, when Jesus comes, should I take his hand? And she said, next time you have a seizure and next time he comes, don't take my hand, take Jesus' hand. And then she writes, the next evening, his condition continued to decline, and he became less aware of his surroundings. All at once, he seemed distracted. Prior to that moment, his head was always pulled tightly against his left shoulder. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked over his right shoulder. His breathing accelerated. He looked to his left and back over his right shoulder many times, as if to follow a conversation among unseen guests. What's their names? He asked in a whisper, and waited for a reply. Then he said, that's a funny name. His family and I shared this incredible moment. Look, he said, exasperated, I have to take my puzzles. I have to take my books. We all stifled laughter as Bryce negotiated the no luggage rule.
I love that. The no luggage rule.
The no luggage rule.
Well, it's true that we hear from all sorts of people. People have had near-death experiences, and then people who have survived them, and then people on their deathbeds who've talked about this feeling of light and lightness.
And love.
And love.
And that is just so tremendous when you hear these stories. Every single one of them is about the powerful, unconditional love that they were just astonished to receive. Just astonished.
Well, this is Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul. We're talking about Midwife for Souls, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul. I'm here with Sister Kathryn, and we are talking about Midwife for Souls. Now, just before the break, I had to bring it up. I have to bring it up again, the stories of angels that people hear. And one of the things that the author talks about, and that you and I actually have talked about, is that the angels don't have to be real angels, that we who are around the dying, no matter what our role is, can be that angel, can be that presence, can be that person, even if we don't feel like we're adequate to the occasion, that God gives us what we need to be that presence for that person.
Sometimes we're called unexpectedly into the role of angel. I know a friend of mine who was dying of pancreatic cancer, and she had been disturbed by some spiritual advice someone had given her. And she eventually called me, and it was such a beautiful experience to walk those last 6 months of her life. Just sharing out of my own experience, my own spirituality, whatever I felt I could share to her questions and her worries and her regrets. And it was a beautiful experience. And you worry, am I saying the right thing? Am I going to make it worse? Is it the best thing I could say?
What is the right thing?
What is the right thing to say? But I learned from that experience, and I think Kathy really brings it out in the book. You really just need to speak out of your heart. And there is no way to speak someone else's words. And God puts those words in your heart. That person came to you for a reason. Again, there's this lovely story that she tells. It's a difficult story. It was a colleague of hers whose daughter had committed suicide, and she found her unexpectedly. And Kathy went running home to her house. And as she got there, she found the woman in the yard, and she looked so disoriented, and she just went up and she hugged her and held her. And gradually they went to a neighbor's house. They made the phone calls. And as her friends started coming in to support her, Kathy responded to one of her friends, oh, this woman is just a mother to everybody in the office. She's such a great mother. And the woman turned around and said, don't you ever say that again. I'm a terrible mother. And Kathy, as a hospice worker, she said, I did the unforgivable sin. I said the wrong thing. And she just felt devastated. But the beautiful thing is, she said she met the woman several years later, and the woman came up to her and said, I never thanked you, but I am so grateful for what you did for me. And Kathy was going like, oh no. And she said, you hugged me, you held me at the most devastating moment of my life. And I will forever be grateful for that moment. So, you know, God uses everything, and people's memories, they remember those beautiful moments. And nothing's lost. Nothing's lost.
Right. Well, you bring up the stories, and I do want to talk a little bit about the structure of the book, because I think that she has found an amazing balance here. There are way too many books, especially in the self-help category, that are just case study after case study after case study, and you either get it or you don't. And then there are those that are prescriptive, and they tell you exactly what you have to do to find true happiness or nirvana or whatever it is you're looking for. But what she does is she tells you some stories, and then she tells you something about herself, and then she shares an idea or something she's learned. She shares poetry, she shares prayers, she shares scripture readings. This book is really a holistic approach to taking care of yourself when you're taking care of someone who's dying.
I think that's really an important point too. When she's sharing about herself, she shares her vulnerability.
Right.
And that gives you as a reader, me as a reader, permission to acknowledge I'm vulnerable in this situation. I don't know the way to go forward, but I can go forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and part of that is indeed prescriptive. And this is the point at which, if we were doing a PowerPoint, it would say takeaways, takeaways for the first session. But there are some kind of action items, I guess you could call them, that I found interesting in here. And I just want to share a couple of them with you. You don't have to actually write this down, people, but to think about. One of them is, and I should note that she says at the beginning, and she says throughout, that she is a Catholic, although she respects other traditions. This is the tradition that she's moved through life with. And one of the first things she says is, learn how to pray out loud. And the quote that so she is at the bedside of someone who grabs her hand, says, say a prayer, and she's all ready to launch into the Our Father or something, and say, no, just talk. And what she says is, you don't understand. I'm a Catholic girl. We don't make them up ourselves, which I just loved, because it is our tradition that we sort of have the prayers. And this gives you permission when you're with someone that there are times when an Our Father or a Hail Mary is very, very appropriate. And there are times when you just really have to speak from your heart. And to learn how to do that out loud is tricky. It can be tricky. And along with that, she also says, speak when inspired. I think that another thing that she talks about when you're with someone who's dying is you want to give them all the space to do all the things they need to do. And sometimes the Holy Spirit wants you to say something, and you'll think, no, it's not up to me to say this, but actually it could be. So she wants you to learn how to pray out loud. She wants you to speak when inspired. And then she also wants you to do two other things. One of them should not come as a big surprise to those of us who talk too much, but it's listen well. And listening well with your heart as well as with your head. That this may be the most significant thing this person will say. This may be the last thing this person will say. And to listen to what they want you to hear rather than what you want to hear, even if it's difficult or painful. So I thought that was significant. And then finally, the final one was take care of the story. And that is really around the family. That these moments are the moments that the family is going to carry with them for the rest of their collective life and their individual life. So in a sense, you're the one who's there to help them interpret it. You're the one who's there to help them move beyond it, or to stay in it and grieve, but to carry that story on beyond the passage of this one person. So I thought those were really helpful things that she gave us to think about that are coming out of her experience. And as you say, she does give you permission to be vulnerable because she tells you how many times she's made the same mistakes.
Yes.
Well, this is Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul. I'm Jeannette de Beauvoir.
And I'm Sister Kathryn.
And we're discussing Kathy Kalina's Midwife for Souls. And I just want to reiterate one more time that this really is a book for everyone. Frankly, everyone will die. So from that point of view, it's right there. But also, all of us at some point or another are going to have someone close to us who is perhaps not in hospice care per se, but is dying in some way. And just having this kind of preparation, I think, is really empowering, enabling, and humbling, because it really shows you that God is the one in control, not us.
And you know, Jeannette, I was thinking about the Catholic tradition of praying for a happy death. And Saint Joseph is the patron of a happy death. And that's always given me like the image of like the last moment. And the beautiful thing about this book is it shows you that it's a process and that it involves, you know, every part of you, your relationships, your relationship with God, your spirituality. It's a psychological journey, it's a physical journey, which is so it's a leap over the wall of your whole being.
Right. And in a sense, it's everyone going over the wall.
Right. Everyone's going over the wall. And what this book for me has given me the permission to do is to realize I don't have to wait till the papers are signed for hospice to begin. And I remember a sister that I had been in the community with for a long time. And she did this very beautiful thing that I hope I do when it's my turn. But weeks before the hospice moment, she brought closure to each of the relationships, special relationships at least, that she had with people. She brought an earthly closure to those relationships, which beautifully gives me a permission to have a heavenly relationship with her. I see her all the time in heaven. I imagine her in heaven. I hear her laughing at me and saying, "Oh, Kathy, if you only knew what it's like up here." I hear her. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I think one of the values of this book is that it really gives you permission to change now, to really
think about that now.
Yeah, and to bring those aspects of eternal realities in our faith, not just I believe in heaven and life everlasting, but to imbibe them and incorporate them into every aspect of my life now.
No, I agree. And I think that that's a really important concept, because it's been said probably too much, but it's true that death has replaced sex as the taboo of our culture. That it used to be, oh, you can't talk about sex. And now, of course, everybody talks about sex, but nobody talks about death. It's this scary thing that maybe if I ignore it, it will go away. And there are classes on death and dying. There are just so many ways that people are trying to come to grips with it. I think that there's a lot in popular culture that has to do with death, that are just other ways of coming to grips with it. And it seems like it would be so much more simple and direct to just think about it, to just think about it and talk about it and pray about it. And I love what that sister did by having some sort of special closure with you before she started that journey.
But you say think about death. How can you think about death? I thought about death before I read this book, but now I have information, I have experiences, I have touch points, I have an idea of what's going to be important at that moment. It gives me everything I need to begin thinking about death. And we make our last will, our testament, we make wills, we do all these kinds of things, but for when we die, but we don't actually prepare ourselves.
Correct.
Because we don't, the law will tell you do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, but we don't really know how do I think about it? Do I make my death a part of my life, in a sense?
A continuum.
A continuum.
A continuum.
Yeah, a beautiful continuum.
Absolutely. Well, I want to remind you that if you look underneath where we're talking, there's a section there for comments. There's a section there you can put in questions. We will look at all of them. If we have time on our 4th episode, we will answer some of them, or we will invite you to join us on air to talk about some of them. But let's talk just briefly before we end, Sister, about what breaks through that kind of reaction that people have against talking about dealing with death and dying.
I think part of it is just information. We have images of it, memories of it, Hollywood images of death, and there's a lot of violence in our concept of death around television, and even in real life in the news, and just information that's apart from all of that. And spirituality. This book also includes prayers at the end. So there's a spiritual preparation, there's a deeper awareness, and there's just openness to the experience. Yeah, openness to the experience.
Right. Well, we've been talking about Kathy Kalina's Midwife for Souls. We're going to talk more about it next week. But until then, I'm Jeannette de Beauvoir.
I'm Sister Kathryn.
And this is Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul.